Hi, everyone. Great to be with you. Yeah, it's my pleasure to introduce our opening plenary today. We have Dr. Michael Muthukrishna. I should mention, Chris said I'm Joe Henrich. So Mike has, I'd like to start off with something that's a little bit unusual. Mike has a bit of a compelling personal narrative. So he was born in Sri Lanka at the beginning of the 30-year Civil War, and his family moved to Botswana and South Africa just as apartheid was being dismantled. Later, Mike lived in Papua New Guinea and finally washed up in Australia, where he went to high school and attended the University of Queensland, where he would eventually obtain 2 degrees, one in psychology and the other in software engineering. Having seen Mike's many contributions since coming to graduate school, this confirms my conviction that a good preparation for our field is an engineering degree, if you think about wanting to reverse engineer the cognitive architecture of our minds. Mike's now a tenured associate professor at the London School of Economics. Before taking that position, he'd received his PhD in psychology from the University of British Columbia in 2015, where he worked with people like Mark Schaller, Jessica Tracy, Ted Slingerland, R. Norrin Zion, and Steve Heine. And then he was briefly a postdoc in Harvard's Department of Human Evolutionary Biology. Among his other affiliations, Mike is the technical director of the Database for Religious History, an interdisciplinary effort to integrate historical expertise with quantitative rigor and computational power. Mike's received a number of awards, the APA Rising Scholars Award, and most recently, the prestigious Global Research Scholar from the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research. And that'll bring him into interdisciplinary contact with lots of scholars, leading scholars from around the world in different disciplines. Now, I've known Mike since before he started graduate school, and I remember when he first poked his head in my office as he was searching for a proper graduate program. And if I wanted to summarize Mike's attributes with 3 items, I would say since the beginning, he's been mission-driven, he's shown immense entrepreneurial leadership and creative problem solving. Mike could easily be I see him as like a CEO of a high-tech startup. So mission-driven, so from his earliest days, Mike wanted to understand human behavior and culture. He didn't want to be a psychologist per se. He had big questions and he wanted to figure out ways to answer them. So he came to graduate school with these questions already in mind, and he has policy goals. He wants to do policy-oriented work and kind of building the framework for doing that now. Entrepreneurial leadership, one of the most amazing things about Mike has been the way he tackles problems by building a team. So he's a natural leader. So even as a young graduate student, he assembled teams, he created networks, he figured out who had what skills and would take advantage of those. When we were writing simulations for our cultural brain hypothesis simulation project, Mike employed a network of programmers around the world to write subroutines to check our simulation. Later, when he would create a short video for Canada's storyteller competition, which he eventually won, he would harness diverse talents, getting a voiceover, music production, and just putting all that together using his leadership skills. And he would always took care of I remember that he always took care of his team. So, for example, asking me to nominate his team members for various awards. And finally, creative problem solving. He's one of those collaborators where I'll say something vague and suggest some kind of half-baked analysis, and Mike will go away and come back later with, hard brass tacks of how exactly we can implement this kind of vague, hand-wavy stuff that I think many advisors often come up with. So he's now emerged as a leader, and he's exploring and contributing to the cultural evolution, innovation, pushing forward the cultural brain hypothesis, publishes in everywhere from psychological science to PLOS computational biology. He works on large-scale cooperation, and most recently trying to understand the historical origins of contemporary psychological variation. So this is the origins of the database of religious history. One of my new favorite paper, and people on Twitter all know this, is Mike's paper, The Cultural Evolution of Genetic Heritability, which is forthcoming in behavioral and brain science. For me, it's a blockbuster for anyone interested in behavioral genetics or cultural evolution. He's also, more than anybody I know, is engaging in public policy. So I know that he's even popped in at number 10 Downing Street. So, all right, and finally, as we get started here, it's worth knowing that Mike is a new father and currently sleep deprived from all his immense paternal investment. So let me introduce Michael Muthukrishna.
All right. Well, thank you for that very kind introduction, and thanks so much for having me here. Can everybody hear me? All good? All right, great. So let me start with this. So this painting here on this slide is, of course, Michelangelo's creation of Adam, which adorns the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. And it's often used as this kind of metaphorical representation of the kinds of questions that many of us are interested in. What it is that makes us human, what drives our psychology and behavior. And, you've got God there in this kind of brain-like robe, I guess. But what I'd like to talk about today is the rest of the ceiling. So it's that broader context that we sometimes forget. It's the broader context that shapes our psychology and our behavior, and together comprises a kind of theory of human behavior. So I see it as a kind of convergence toward a cultural evolutionary psychology. So between an evolutionary psychology that recognizes us as another animal, a product of natural selection and sexual selection and so on, but also a new kind of animal with a second source of information. So another way to say it is that our psychology is a product of millions of years of genetic evolution, but also thousands of years of cultural evolution and a short lifetime of experience. So traditional psychology, if we want to call it the standard social science model, has focused almost entirely on that short lifetime of experience. But if you want to get to a kind of theory of human behavior, you need to be able to explain not only how our psychology works today, but why it is that we live in the world that we live in, why it is that we differ cross-culturally. So you want to get to historical psychology, and certainly a psychology that goes beyond weird. Okay, so what I would argue is that cultural evolutionary psychology, as a kind of theory of human behavior, represents a true phase shift that other more mature sciences have gone through. So it's a phase shift that draws together seemingly disconnected phenomenon and helps us separate the sense from the nonsense. So just to give you some quick examples of what I mean, once upon a time, the physical world was chaotic, right? It was a world of capricious gods creating the weather, Thor banging on his hammer or whatever. And then along come folks like Newton and Maxwell and Einstein, and they kind of bring order to this chaos, right? The weather is still difficult to predict, but at least we now know how it works. And because we have these underlying theories, we can predict the motions of celestial bodies to the point of landing a spacecraft on an asteroid. Now, Maxwell in particular always fascinates me, right? I mean, at a time of muskets and whale oil and horse-drawn carriages, long before we could control electricity, he was able to write down equations for electromagnetism that others like Einstein could build on to get to special relativity. And I can do this for chemistry. So we do this in this paper, Apollo theory. So once upon a time, the chemical world was chaotic. Metals mixed with liquid to create gases, and sulfur, carbon, and saltpeter combined to create gunpowder. But no matter how hard even Newton himself tried, we couldn't turn lead into gold. So it's this mix of indistinguishable sense and nonsense, chemistry and also alchemy. And then along come Lavoisier and Mendeleev and Mayer, bringing order to this chaos. Proteins, still difficult to predict, but at least we now know how they work. We know why lithium behaves like sodium, and also why lead can't be turned into gold. So we can separate the sense from the nonsense. And I can do this for the biological world. Once upon a time, the biological world was chaotic. There seems to be no rhyme or reason why some animals lay eggs and others have live births, and the peacock has an elaborate tail, but the peahen doesn't. And then along come Darwin and Fisher and Wright and Hamilton and all the others that we're familiar with, bringing order to this chaos. Species difficult to predict still. Ecologies are still difficult to disentangle, but at least we now know the rules by which they work. So I think today, the social and the psychological world are still chaotic. Democracies seem to weaken. New technologies seem to disrupt in ways we can't fully understand. There seem to be these mismatches. People seem impossible to predict. But I think we now have the beginnings of an understanding of the rules and the forces that have shaped our biology, including our psychology, that have shaped our behavior and that shape our societies. It's this mix of genetic and cultural. It's cultural evolution leading to institutions. And so we can begin to affect social change. And for that reason, I think it's a super exciting time to be in the evolutionary human sciences. Okay, so there are a couple of papers that I think really embody cultural evolutionary psychology. They're not the only ones. There's an entire body of research, but I think they're very illustrative examples. The first of these is Niche Diversity Can Explain Cross-Cultural Differences in Personality Structure by Smaldino, Lukaszewski, von Ruden, and Gerben, which tries to develop a theory of personality. So the big five is often seen, it's atheoretical, completely atheoretical, but it's often seen as this kind of paragon achievement within psychology. Finally, something that replicates. But it turns out it doesn't really replicate very well cross-culturally. So it seems like there's a big two among the Chimane forager farmers of Bolivia. And the covariation between those factors, so how independent they are, varies with socioecological complexity. So there's fewer factors with lower socioecological complexity. And so what this paper does is it builds on this earlier work documenting these differences, but then it develops a theory that's connected to other theories as part of a theoretical framework, and that helps explain the existing data, but then also makes additional predictions, in this case for cross-cultural variation. So the variance in traits should increase with socioecological complexity, as well as historical variation, something that I don't think they were able to test. That is that we may see more factors in the future and fewer factors in the past, a big six, a big 10 perhaps. Another example is this well-known paper, The Cultural Evolution of Pro-Social Religions by Naran-Zion, Sharif, Gervais, Willard, McNamara, Slingerland, and Henrich. Again, this paper develops a theory, again, part of a broader theoretical framework, in this case to explain pro-social religions. It builds, again, on a large body of work on cognitive biases like mentalizing and teleological thinking and mind-body dualism, but then it makes predictions for cross-cultural variation and historical variation that it tests using existing data or cross-cultural experiments where necessary. And what it does is it connects to mechanisms that sustain cooperation, because it predicts that the power, the scope, and the size of deities as supernatural punishers should co-evolve with a society's size and complexity, because that's what religions are doing. They help us transition from reputational-based systems to institutional-based systems. That is, any major world religion today has some common elements, not because of some mysticism, because it had to have these elements that supported large-scale cooperation in order to be a major world religion. The religions that didn't have that, they're no longer with us. Okay, so these papers and others like them, they emphasize theory connected to a broader theoretical framework. They emphasize historical psychology. They emphasize global variation. They make formal predictions using empirical tests to test these, sometimes using fieldwork and sometimes non-experimental methods, whatever's necessary, right? And together, I think they're examples of the emergence of this kind of theory of human behavior. Okay, so with this frame in mind, I want to talk about some of my work within cultural evolutionary psychology. So I'm going to begin with the cultural brain hypothesis, which is a theory from first principles, building on broader cultural evolution, that predicts how brain evolution and adaptive knowledge and sociality and life history and mating strategies, social learning and social learning strategies are actually connected to one another in our species, but also in other species. And then I'm going to discuss how these cultural brains specific to us come together to create collective brains, briefly getting into cooperation, corruption, and what I call the paradox of diversity. And then I'll end on some future directions, moving beyond weird psychology, considering the cultural evolution of genetic heritability, historical psychology, and how we might think more about public policy. Okay, so the cultural brain hypothesis, as I said, links various aspects of our species. For some quick background, brain size among hominins tripled in the last few million years. Our brains are about 3 times as large as the chimps. But it wasn't just our species. We see encephalization in primates, we see them in cetaceans, and we see them across other mammalian taxa. And you might think, well, that makes sense, right? I mean, bigger brains are better. Who doesn't want a big brain? But if you do think that, you should wonder, why don't all species have giant brains? What's the constraint here? Well, part of the answer is the brain tissue is very energetically expensive. So at a minimum, those brains need to help you pay their energy bills. They need to help you find calories. And a lot of animals, including ourselves for a lot of our history, spend a lot of time just looking for food and then processing it, just sitting there chewing, right? So really what an animal wants is the smallest brain that lets it do that, lets it find calories and also outcompete conspecifics and, evade predators and so on. And so encephalization needs an explanation. And there are various explanations. Some focus on the climate, some focus on ecology, some on technical intelligence. I think the most well-known are probably those that focus on the social side of things, so like the social brain hypothesis. So this is the idea that brains are for supporting the complexities of life in larger groups, right? And because the social brain hypothesis is so popular, I want to contrast the cultural brain hypothesis to it. So I'll start with the most well-known finding between the neocortex ratio and mean group size among primates. So the cultural brain hypothesis also makes the same prediction for a brain size group size relationship. But in the cultural brain hypothesis, it's an indirect relationship, as you'll see in a moment. rather than a direct relationship. More generally, rather than, it moves the emphasis away from kind of brains for social living, what I sometimes call tricking and tracking conspecifics, and moves them more toward learning in general. So brains are for what you think they're for. They're for storing and managing and organizing and using information. Some of that adaptive knowledge might be social strategies, but it doesn't have to be. It could be where the food is and how to access it. And so I think the way to think about the cultural brain hypothesis is not a competitor to the social brain hypothesis. It's more of a generalization that encompasses that as well as ecological and technical explanations. And just to further emphasize that, Suzanne Schultz, who's a big figure in the social brain hypothesis, and I and neuroscientist Karen Fox have a paper where we tested both the social brain hypothesis and the cultural brain hypothesis among whales and dolphins, cetaceans. And I think we're both satisfied that it reflects our understanding of the theories. Okay, so what does the model say? Well, first off, it suggests that there are two strategies in the animal kingdom for growing your brain. Strategy one is you try to figure everything out on your own. So you engage in asocial learning, building these causal models, maybe some trial and error learning. The other way to do it is to engage in social learning. So it's like the kid in class who doesn't actually study, just comes in and cheats. They just copy what everyone else is doing. It's cheaper, it's more efficient, it's easier. And what we find is that humans are kind of an extreme version of that kid in class who cheats. We just kind of arrive on the scene, don't try to figure out the world, figure out what the past generation are doing and try to build on that. So from our analytic and computational models, we derive two sets of predictions, some for the social learners and some for the asocial learners. Now, we all know there's this kind of bias in science, right? If you want to get published in Science or Nature, you don't write papers that say babies, kind of stupid, animals, also stupid, adult humans, actually kind of bright. You write papers that say, look at this amazing thing that this baby can do, and look at this amazing thing that animals can do, and adult humans constantly making mistakes. And so for this reason, there's a bias, and we've studied a lot of social animals with a lot of interesting behavior, such as primates, and we've been able to test some of the predictions of our theory in this way, right? So the first thing, as I said, is we predict the relationship between brain size and group size, stronger for social learning animals, consistent with what we find among primates. We also predict a relationship between brain size and reliance on social learning among social learning animals, obviously, which is what we find among chimps. And we make predictions such as a relationship between brain size and the juvenile period among social learning animals, but a weaker to non-existent relationship among asocial learning animals, which again is what we find among primates. Now, that data, the primate data, it wasn't analyzed in this way, but it existed before. So, maybe we cheated. Maybe we fit our theory to the data. We didn't, but we could have, right, in principle. So what we did was we spent the next 7 years compiling a large data set of whales and dolphins, cetaceans. Whales and dolphins are also social learners, particularly the toothed whales and the dolphins, but they live in this very different alien underwater world without hands and an inability to make fire. They're phylogenetically separated from us by about 85 to 100 million years. So if we can find consistent relationships in this completely different taxa, that's good evidence. And that is what we find. And I think strong evidence for the cultural brain hypothesis. So we ran a phylogenetic path analysis, and we found that there isn't a straightforward relationship between brain size and group size. Consistent with the cultural brain hypothesis, we find that brains are largest in these kind of moderately sized, socially intense groups, and are smaller in these large, almost like schools of whales, and also smaller in these kind of smaller pods. And more specifically, we also find that brain size is highly related to social repertoire. So these are things like signature whistles and group hunting, socially acquired behavioral repertoire. There's a strong relationship. So that gives us some confidence, right? The theory fits nicely. But the problem is there's an entire other regime here on asocial learners that we just don't have a lot of data on because we don't spend as much time on them. But there is one taxa that is asocial, and we do have quite a bit of data on, and that is Octopuses Cephalopods. So we have a new grant where we're basically trying to do the same thing, hopefully in 3 years, not 7, compiling all of the data on cephalopods and testing the asocial predictions of the theory. So if I don't expect the theory to fit perfectly. I expect we're going to have to learn as we go. But that would be nice, that we'd be moving more toward a more general theory of brain evolution. Okay, what is the cultural brain hypothesis? What's going on here? Why am I even talking about this? Here's how it goes. So brains, as I said, are for storing and managing information. Bigger brains, you can store and manage more information. And you can acquire that information through asocial learning, trial and error learning, building a kind of causal model understanding in your head, or social learning, just kind of copying what other people or other members of your group are doing. Now, if you have more information, it increases the carrying capacity of your group. More individuals can survive because the information is adaptive. But if you're a social learner, those larger groups are more useful to you in another way. They give you more information that can ultimately find its way to you. And so there's a stronger relationship between brain size and group size among social learners. That's the indirect relationships that we find. Now, as the information accumulates, if you're a social learner, because it's such an efficient way to learn without figuring things out on your own, you begin to rely more on that social information. And you need more time to do it. So you have the evolution of a longer juvenile period. So just an extended period where you can do a little bit more learning, which further extends your reliance on social learning, because now you're investing time in exploring rather than exploiting, as Alison Gopnik puts it. Now, under some conditions, you can start to develop social learning strategies like learning from non-parents, oblique learning, or developing learning strategies as to who's got better knowledge that's worth paying attention to. Within the cultural brain hypothesis, there are a set of parameters that lead to this kind of autocatalytic takeoff between brain size and adaptive knowledge and group size, reliance on social learning, these social learning strategies, and the extension of a juvenile period. This extreme reliance on social learning. And we call those set of parameters the cumulative cultural brain hypothesis. So what are they? Well, there's 4 key things that emerge in our model. The first is high transmission fidelity. So it is critical that you copy without really understanding. Just copy things without really understanding them. And you don't realize it because of what I think is the illusion of explanatory depth. You believe you understand the world more than you do, but you do it all the time. You hold deeply in your hearts strongly held beliefs that you don't actually have direct access to. For example, you will swear up and down that you are on a spheroid rotating around a star, one of many stars in the Milky Way, one of many galaxies in the universe, right? You believe that with all your heart. And they say seeing is believing, but you do it in denial of your everyday experience of a flat Earth with the sun tracing the sky from east to west. And you'll say, well, I was in a plane, I've seen pictures and, and whatever, but it's not all that different as someone who believes in spirits. And I was like, I heard it in the forest and, the smart people said so. You believe this because the brightest people most people also believe this. Your computer may as well be magic. You press a series of buttons, you get to your email, and you got to catch up on it. The wireless goes out and suddenly, you're like, turn it on, turn it off again. Cooking, you've got jaws too weak and guts too short for anything other than cooked food, but you don't really understand the biology or chemistry of cooking. You literally, in this case, follow a recipe and then you get something edible. All right, I'm spending too much time on this. Your life is filled with these kinds of recipes. Now, in order for this model to work, it actually relies, if you want an autocatalytic takeoff, it relies on some early pre-adaptations. One of the critical adaptations, that this goes beyond the model, by the way, is I think bipedalism around 4 million years ago. What did bipedalism do? It did a couple of things. First, it freed up our hands. Why was that useful? Well, first, I can begin, if I have information that's worth transmitting, I need to find ways to better transmit it. And so I can supplement my kind of guttural utterances with my hand movements. I'm sitting in a room by myself talking to a camera, but I'm still moving my hands for some reason, right? And this can kick off a kind of Baldwin-style process where if there's knowledge worth paying attention to, then genes that can help you learn those gestures faster can be selected for. That allows you to develop more gestures onward and upward to a full-blown language. Now, you can also have genetic adaptations like gaze following or shared intentionality and theory of mind. If other people have stuff worth paying attention to, then it might be worth figuring out what they're doing and what they are paying attention to. And of course, full-blown language. The other thing that freeing up your hands does is it cheapens the cost of tools. So we see the earliest tools, stone tools, at least around 2.6 million years ago. What we don't see are the kind of wooden tools or bone tools potentially that existed before that. But if I'm quadrupedal, like a chimp, I'm not going to invest a lot of time in making a tool because I can't really take it with me. It's hard to walk around with this big stone in my hands, right? And so instead, I won't invest time. But if I'm bipedal, I can nap that stone, knowing that I can carry it to the next place I go, right? The other reason I think that early culture was probably quite plausible is because of fire. So we see evidence of fire 1 to 2 million years ago, but a lot of adaptations for fire, like the short guts and weak jaws. Fire would have unlocked a lot of calories for us, but it was also something worth transmitting. I don't know if you've ever tried to light a fire without knowing anything about it, maybe as a kid. It's hard. It's really hard. But once you know how to do it, even then it's hard, but it's a lot easier once you have some skills. So there's something worth transmitting. Okay, I spent too long on that. The other thing that we predict is a monogamish kind of reproductive skew. So not too strong where a few males dominate the scene. One way to get there is cooperative breeding. It's not the only way, but one way to get there is cooperative breeding. I really like the idea of cooperative breeding because it solves another problem for our species. It creates a gradient for us to engage in oblique learning and those learning strategies. Why? Chimps learn from their moms. More moms actually lead to more tools in a chimp society. But if I've got more than one mom and I've got more than one dad, like other people looking after her, I don't have to worry about access. I can think, well, does Aunt May or Aunt Martha actually have more knowledge worth paying attention to? So it's the evolution of oblique learning and learning strategies. The third thing that we find is the importance of smart ancestors or asocial learning efficacy. Those social learners need something to exploit. In the early Boyd and Richardson models, they predict this kind of massive environmental variability leading to individual learning, and this moderate level of environmental variability leading to social and cultural learning. That's perfect. That is what we see actually in the records. But that would have selected for smart asocial learners could be exploited by social learners once things settle down. The final thing that we find is the importance of the ecology. You need a rich ecology. So some people might argue, well, surely a more challenging ecology should lead to a bigger brain, and there's some value in that argument. But at least in principle, there need to be calories in the environment. There needs to be energy in the environment that I can, at least in principle, if I know fire and tools, I can go hunt that bison. I can cook it up. And so another way to say that is bigger brains are more likely in forests than they are in deserts. Okay. So that's the cultural brain hypothesis, which is interesting if you care about animals and things like that. But I want to get to the cumulative cultural brain hypothesis, and more importantly, the link from the cumulative cultural brain hypothesis to collective brains. So what happens when you've got these brains that are in a society which has lots of information spread across multiple people, more than I can learn in my lifespan, and I've got a brain engaging in these learning strategies? Who's got the knowledge worth learning? What kind of structures lead to more cumulative culture? So that's what Joe Henrich and I wrote about in this paper on the collective brain, where we argue that our societies and social networks behave like collective brains, innovating through the transmission of information through these networks without the need for a specific innovator any more than your brain requires a specific neuron, right? You got Darwin and you got Wallace, you got Newton and you got Leibniz, and so on. So how does this work? How do you get to the collective brain? Well, imagine the knowledge starts to grow, right? And at some point, you max out on a brain size. It's just too hard to birth this big brain, right? We actually see evidence for this in the medical literature. So doctors used to think that big babies were difficult to birth, or it was totally random. It turns out it's big heads that are difficult to birth. So even in the variation that you see in our species, which shows some amount of selection, I think, once you get to about the 85th percentile, emergency cesareans and emergency instrumental birth kind of just hockey sticks off, right? Big brains are great if you can safely birth them. Now, the other thing that you can do is you can extend your juvenile period. So not only can you delay puberty, but you can also create a cultural adolescence. So the period from when you can reproduce to when you actually do, you can push on that to spend more time learning. And this creates a new problem. So it's not the ability to give birth to a big head, it's the ability to give birth at a later age. You're delaying your peak productivity, right? The other thing you can do is get better at learning. So in our education, in hunter-gatherer societies, not a huge amount of teaching going on. You kind of let kids hang around. After the Industrial Revolution, when you actually had a pile of information that you need to transmit, we got to get kids into school and we got to efficiently download this package. You got to catch up on the last several thousand years of human history. Let's go. Phonemes, numbers, go, go, go. And we're constantly trying to innovate in this way. So now the other thing, of course, is that we're giving birth, because we've got these giant heads, we're giving birth to them prematurely so they can spend some time outside the womb, continuing to grow their brains. And our babies, I've got 3, as Joe said, and so they're kind of floppy, useless messes, right? They're not like a gazelle ready to run about. They're not even like like a chimp ready to latch. They're truly, truly useless. And so you need some help. You need some help. You need some amount of alloparenting, some cooperative breeding. Even in today's society, we've got childcare. We subsidize single mothers. We kind of engage in some amount of cooperative breeding. But another way to do it, of course, is to get dad involved. And here's where you can, where cultural evolution meets traditional ev psych. You need to get dad involved. But dad, of course, needs to know that it's his. So one common solution across the world is control over female sexuality and control over male resources. It's not the only solution. So among the Na, for example, we don't find dads. Brothers are expected to look after their sisters' children, and anyone can reproduce with anyone. And culture nuances this. So no doubt contraception is shifting things. There's some nice work in the economics literature on this. So Alessina Gugliano and Nunn have this paper on the way agricultural practices affect sex differences, attitudes towards sexes even today. So if you're a plow-based agricultural society, it requires quite a bit of strength, even with an ox, relative to a hoe-based society where both men and women can use this. And what you find is that descendants of those societies, long after they've given up plowing and hoe agriculture, they still have greater sex differences. Similarly, Anke Becker shows that in pastoralist societies, where men are away for long periods and paternal uncertainty is quite high, female sexuality is far more controlled by both men and women. So you get this nuancing that the culture is doing with this fundamental issue that's created by these premature babies. Now, if you're going to delay childhood and delay adolescence, you also want to live a long time. So you begin to extend the lifespan, but you also want to potentially keep people around beyond their reproductive period, so create menopause. So this is what we call the information grandmother hypothesis. So grandparents might supplement calories in a kind of Kristen Hawkes calorie grandmother hypothesis way. But they're also kind of like Wikipedias of their time, right? Like parents, when they're reproducing, especially early on, they're kind of young and also a little bit useless. And so those Wikipedias, they've lived a long time. And by virtue of living a long time, they've got a lot of knowledge. And grandparents around the world readily broadcast that to multiple children. And even as their minds go, they seem to want to tell stories more and more. Okay. But there are other ways, right? The other thing, of course, you can do is grow your population. And as you grow your population, you can do what I think is the most effective way to handle the growing information. That is to divide it up. It is simply the case that I cannot, with my limited size brain, learn everything that I need to in a modern world. But with a large enough population, I can get super smart at just one thing and be stupider at everything else, knowing that there's enough other people to provide me with food and shelter and defense and so on, which I'm not going to be able to do on my own, right? So let's deal with each of these. So first off, some of the old models like Henrich 2004 predict sociality is connected to cultural complexity. So it's not population size per se, it's effective population size, like in biology. It's the number of learners you have access to, which is a function of both size and interconnectedness. So Michelle Klein and Rob Boyd have this nice paper where they show the population size is connected to toolkit size and techno units. And even with the same population size, the more interconnected populations have more tools. In our paper, we show how sociality can also affect the very means of transmission. So here we show that languages with more speakers, controlling for phylogenetic relatedness, are more efficient. So what you want in information flow, and I hope this talk is achieving that, is a steady flow. You don't want like boring, piles of information, boring. And you do that by optimizing word length to information content. So you can quantify information content of a word in the context you find it, like the surprise factor entropy. So the example we use in the paper is, it is raining today. I should really bring my, if the next word is umbrella, low information content. If the next word is shotgun, huge information content. So you can correlate that with word length, and you find that it's more highly correlated among some languages than others. I really like French here. It's the exception that proves the rule. It's more efficient than it should be for its number of language speakers, but of course it used to be a lot closer to here. Okay. We've also tested this experimentally. So Max Dere and Kempe Masudi have papers on this. In our paper, we hold constant population size and change interconnectedness. We get people to create this image in the GIMP, a notoriously difficult to use Photoshop equivalent. And we also train people up as experts to watch the predicted decline and predicted equilibrium. What do we find? Well, if you have access to more models, culture can accumulate. I really like this result because you don't have to look at the stats or the graphs or anything. You can see it in the data and what people produce. Once somebody gets it and you have access to more models, it gets transmitted reliably generation by generation, to the point where the worst person in this group is actually better than the best person in this group. But also, this is kind of not super surprising. Like, okay, you've got more models, you accumulate culture more. All right, cool. What I think is more interesting and more surprising is when you train people up as experts, you see the predicted differential decline and the predicted differential equilibrium, which I think is really nice evidence. Okay. Of course, in the modern world, sociality has extended in ways that we really ought to be paying more attention to and theorizing a lot more about over time through the printing press, through radio, television, and most importantly, through the internet and social media today. All of these also affect transmission fidelity. I used the education example before. If you can transmit it more effectively, you're going to have more innovation. But as I said, the big one, the good bang for buck, is in the diversity. It's in the division of labor. How does this work? Well, I got a 10-size brain. I'm maxed out. That's what I can, that's what my mother could birth. And I got 10 things to learn. So I can reach skill unit 1 on all of those 10 things. But imagine I live in a society where it's large enough that I can reliably say, look, you guys take care of the 5 things. I'll take care of these other 5 things. Now I can reach skill unit 2 on those things, right? If I'm in a bigger society, I maybe focus on one of those things. And as a society, we can reach skill unit 10. Divide it up further and the sky's the limit. But it introduces a new problem. So yes, a doctor in New York can focus on a tiny part of the renal system, and a doctor in a small town will do medicine. But I'm now, as I said, really smart at one thing and stupid at everything else. And so this creates the paradox of diversity. It offers opportunities for recombination through what I call intellectual arbitrage. You can win yourself a Nobel Prize stealing something from one discipline and just bringing it to another, often from psych to econ. But it also creates coordination problems. And you know this, right? So if you've ever tried to work across disciplines, humanities science collaborations, or even evolutionary scientists, just slightly different from one another, human behavioral ecologists and evolutionary psychologists and cultural evolution people, it's tough. Different assumptions, different ways of working. There's a paradox here. So diversity is the fuel for innovation and economic growth, but it poses a challenge to communication, coordination, and cooperation. And it's actually analogous to the problem of evolvability in genetic evolution. So it's not just about adaptation per se, but the ability to adapt, which means tolerance for diversity, because that's where the new stuff comes from. Aren't you glad we have epidemiologists that we ignored for the last several decades, but now they're kind of important? The degree to which diversity has, its benefits versus these costs depends on the structure of the diversity. So when diversity is diffuse, people are forced to find ways to work. When it's clustered or segregated, then you have competing cultural groups that potentially come into conflict. They come into conflict more often when there's limited resource availability. So that is when the world is more zero-sum than positive-sum. So often when we do these kind of cooperation experiments, we set them up as like, think of the prisoner's dilemma, defect or cooperate. It's not really like that. I belong to multiple embedded and overlapping groups: my family, my friends, my region, my religion, my country, and maybe humanity, right? What matters is the scale of cooperation I choose to work at in order to best access resources. And that means potential conflict between scales or between groups. And so I think the policy challenge is very much recognizing this kind of elephant in the room and figuring out how to reap those benefits while reducing those costs, broadening the umbrella to bring more people in. There's many aspects of this puzzle that are super important that shed light on this. The first is cooperation. We are a deeply cooperative species. Our greatest achievements and our worst atrocities are cooperative acts. And so understanding the origins and psychology of human cooperation is pretty central. Lots of papers, including my own, on cooperation, often start with cooperation is this big puzzle, and it's so central to so many sciences. And it's how we start. In reality, we kind of understand cooperation quite well. At least we understand many of the mechanisms and how they work. But whatever mechanisms that you're proposing, or combinations of mechanisms, you need to be able to explain 4 central puzzles in human cooperation. First, scale and intensity differences. Some groups are cooperating on the scale of bands of related individuals. Other groups are cooperating on the scale of millions or billions of unrelated individuals, sometimes from very different walks of life, trying to forge a country together. Domain differences. So in small scale societies, one group might cooperate on fishing and down the river, another group cooperates on house building, but not vice versa. In nation states, some groups cooperate on defense and other groups cooperate on healthcare, but not the other way around. You need to explain rapid expansion. So 12,000 years ago, yours and my ancestors all lived in small hunter-gatherer groups. And today, as I said, we live in these groups of anonymous strangers. How do you explain that? Especially because many of the mechanisms, like reputational-based systems, can also support non-cooperative and maladaptive behavior. So many of the mechanisms can, in fact, undermine one another. So I think one ignored question beyond how do we cooperate is, how do scales of cooperation interact? We understand how we cooperate. How do they interact with each other? So one of my contributions has been thinking about corruption as one scale of cooperation undermining another. So in this paper, for example, we set up institutional punishment, a very effective method, and we show how we can undermine it with direct reciprocity, bribery. So when a president gives his daughter a contract, we call that nepotism, but it's also inclusive fitness, undermining our institutions. When I give a job to a friend or a friend of a friend, that's cronyism, but it's also indirect or direct reciprocity, undermining our meritocracies, right? So your explanation might in fact undermine higher scales of cooperation. Okay. And so you need to be thinking about how these cultural groups cooperating with different mechanisms come into conflict with one another. Joe Henrich, for example, has recently talked about how undermining kin relations can set the stage for individualism and democracies. And these are all very central to the paradox of diversity. The second is history. So if you want to build a science of humans, it means going beyond weird psychology. And that doesn't just mean beyond weird samples. It means beyond weird researchers who come at it with a weird, narrow life, as a particular life experience, asking weird questions. And so you also need to be kind of theorizing about the origins of cross-cultural differences, not just, selecting multiple samples from other places, which are going to be some combination of not only adaptations to local conditions, but also historical and path dependence, right? So I mentioned the example of agricultural practices long after people have given up the plow, affecting cultural practices in new migrants. And we offered lots of examples on religion, the origins of weird psychology, democracy, trust, sex differences, personality, individualism, collectivism. The other thing that we look at is understanding the psychology of the past. So getting data from dead minds. This is, we get a sliver of this when we think about cohort differences. But when we think deeper, when we think further back into the past, it may as well be another country. So there are ways that you can extract that information, which we go into. So what I guess I would say is that cultural evolutionary psychology must also be a science of history for a more complete theory of human behavior. I just want to add that this paper also introduces some techniques for dredging up, I guess, data from dead minds, as well as causal inference techniques that are common in economics, but ironically developed in psychology, just not commonly used. Because there are other hypotheses on the table for these differences, it's also critical to integrate cultural evolution and behavioral genetics to understand that the environmental term is not this inert backdrop on which genes act, but is actually a quickly evolving second line of inheritance. So in this paper, which incidentally is still accepting commentaries, you can get in even though it's after the deadline, we argue, for example, how culturally favored traits will actually end up more heritable for reasons that have nothing to do with genetics. We explain how that happens. Or how the same genes can be positively associated with, say, intelligence in one place, but those same genes can be negatively associated with intelligence in another place. We also offer some formalizations for thinking a bit more deeply and clearly about these effects. Finally, and probably most importantly, we offer some tools for measuring culture in this Beyond Weird Psychology paper. So here we show that once you can measure culture as differences in distributions, because cultures are not homogeneous, they're actually overlapping distributions, you find that it's correlated with everything from personality to blood donations to whether you return your lost wallets. And we can also show how it's clustered in different societies, going back to the paradox of diversity. So the over-scrutinized United States, we know that the South is different to New England, is different to California. But actually, the United States is a very diverse place. It's just that it's diffusely diverse. It's not as diverse as, say, the other major four populations, the European Union, India, or even China. Now, before I end, I'm almost done. I just want to note, which is something I really noticed when I was doing this research, that the psychological terra incognita. So cultural psychologists have built a career on looking at some of the differences between the East and the West, but those are tiny compared to what we're seeing in other places, the South Pacific. So all of these great things on the map, we don't know what's going on here. Central America, much of sub-Saharan Africa, the South Pacific, and parts of the Middle East. We've got lots of anthropological data, which I think is super useful. But what I would love to see, so I'm super inspired by the Basara Center for Behavioral Economics in Kenya. I think as a result of that, we're going to learn a lot about Kenyan psychology. But what I would like to see is the kind of industrial and rigorous approach of psychology applied to psychological observatories spread across the world. So something I'm kind of working on in the background, and I'd love to, if anyone else is interested, let me know. Okay, so I'm going to end on a few future directions. Basically, what I guess I'm arguing is to complete the Darwinian revolution means moving toward more general theories of human behavior. Some of that actually, I think, means letting go of assumptions that hold us back. One of the assumptions, I think, is the focus on, God touching Adam, the focus on human intelligence. So as I said, the illusion of explanatory depth is, I think, a really underrated finding in psychology that suggests that the world is not only complicated, it's actually more complicated than our psychology allows us to believe. It also means going beyond, at least in my neck of the woods, there's a lot of focus on human origins. In other parts, it's on human, present day humans. But I think we can start to think about, through historical psychology, human futures. We're going to need wider, deeper historical and longer term representative data. I know Richard McElrath has argued a lot for the long-term representative data, which, as I said, means going beyond weird psychology, weird researchers, weird questions, weird ontologies and ways of thinking toward historical psychology. And finally, I personally am very inspired by Gibson and Brunswick and the idea that if your theories don't work in the real world, they really don't work at all. And so what we really need is a cultural evolutionary psychological public policy, which means thinking about interaction between scales of cooperation, interactions between content and learning biases. So yes, we have a prestige bias and a conformist bias. And yes, we focus on mating. How do these interact with one another? Thinking about integration across the human and social sciences, we might want to borrow things from economics and poli-sci and anthro and so on. And thinking again about how we can interact with policy, so application through policy. Charles Efferson and Sonia Vogt have made some strides here. I've done some work in this area, but I'm going to leave it there. I'm probably over time as it is. So thank you very much. I look forward to your questions. Thanks, guys. I love the emojis. There's a variety. No questions? Elena.
Yes. I am a humble graduate student, but since no one is asking anything, let me ask you. I come from a country with a lot of nepotism and corruption. I'm from Russia. So do you think that the paradox of this thing, so you talked about how the two levels of imposed cooperation are undermining one another, right? Can that be the case that our psychological architecture is not yet ready for this higher institutional level cooperation in terms of being rewarded? So we haven't been there for long, right? It's only for kind of a few centuries that we've been there. So probably we haven't yet evolved to find that as a rewarding experience, to choose the institutional level cooperation versus this direct or indirect reciprocity.
Yeah. What a great question. So, I think one of the lessons is that our cognitive architecture is very flexible. You can see that in your own life versus many others. But it is far more natural, let's say, to us, or it's easy to slip backward into favoring your family and favoring your friends. And you need to do a lot of work to kind of move yourself away from that. So there's a few things. First, you get these kind of equilibria that are self-sustaining. For example, if you're in a place where the governments can't meet your needs, then you have to rely on your friends and family. That means, in whatever job you have, means favoring your friends and family. But that, of course, undermines the government. And so you're kind of trapped. And the real policy question is, how do you get yourself out of these traps that emerge in the models? Yeah, so in Joe Henrich's work, he's argued that Europe, for example, in undermining cousin marriage or undermining these kind of kin networks that would otherwise undermine democracies and large institutions, it sets the stage for getting further. So I don't think I would phrase it as kind of that our cognitive architecture is mismatched, but there are pulls in the system. There are attractors in the system, and it's far easier to slip backward. The final thing I'll say on that is that competition is probably critical to this. So if you're in a competition between groups where there is a reward that can be shared for the group, like you're in a company and there's a big market, then you might forego these kind of lower scales of cooperation, right? Because when you're at war, you want the best person to be the general. When you're not at war, then maybe your brother-in-law will be just fine. So folks like Dambisa Moyo have argued that foreign aid can sustain autocracies in Africa because they provide autocracies with resources to cooperate in small groups like Russia at the expense of a population that can't engage in sufficient collective action to undermine that autocracy. But the resources are what matter.
Thanks, great answer.
Thanks, Elena, for your question. Clark.
Hey, Michael, how you doing? Thank you for good. Thanks for a great talk. So I have I wanted to ask perhaps a challenging question that I think follows from your last slide here. It seems to me, and I think we could spend a lot of time arguing about this, that evolutionary theory as it stands and cultural evolutionary theory, evolutionary psychology theory are sort of rooted in this very Western capitalist mode of thinking that's all about costs and benefits and markets. And so you can see that. I mean, you mentioned that we need some non-weird perspectives in science, and I agree with that. But I think that one way that we can see that our current science is weird is that it's so infused with these concepts, and you can trace their intellectual genealogy to Adam Smith and other kinds of people. So, I mean, I wonder what your thoughts are for expanding beyond that, but also do you think that there's a danger in taking that particular framework with its genealogy that it has and then projecting it into public policy for the rest of the world? Are we in danger of baking in an ideology of the West in creating an evolutionarily based policy for human affairs?
What a challenging question. So I guess the first thing that I would say is I agree with some parts of that, in that the ways that we think about this are no doubt shaped by the historical trajectory of weird societies. It's hard for me to say that that's all that's going on. I think there are fundamental things like in natural selection that do involve fitness benefits, if you like. Groups will outcompete others. So the colonial story is groups accessing vast amounts of energy resources and using those to build up societies that outcompete smaller groups. Can you stop that with norms? Maybe. Buckminster Fuller's whole thing, like, you got to build a better model. So bringing more people to the table with alternative accounts that may do a better job of predicting the world as we see it, even if that means measuring things differently, is the only way to get out of that. You can't criticize a model, I think, without just, developing a better model that'll do a better job. I don't see this as kind of, again, the devil's in the details. I don't see this as kind of redesigning our economic systems to be more about evolution. There are ways to get this horribly wrong. So I don't know if like Jeff Skelling at Enron, really big into Darwin. He developed rank and yank as a result of that. So what he said is, we're going to rank everybody and we're going to take the bottom 10% every time, right? He missed the cooperation bit. So he created a zero-sum situation where people were not working together. They were clawing, tooth and nail. And so that's not what I'm suggesting. I guess what I'm suggesting is that evolutionary thinking, by virtue of being hopefully the rules by which the world works, give us insight into problems of economic development and give us insight into healthcare and so on. You might say, well, economic development doesn't matter. But I think if you go to some of these countries and you ask people, they do care a heck of a lot about economic development. So in collaboration with whatever it is that different countries are trying to optimize, you can use these tools. But again, it's an unanswerable question until we bring more diverse perspectives to the table.
Thank you.
Thanks. Arthur.
Hi, can you hear me? My microphone.
I can hear you.
Okay. That was a wonderful smorgasbord of theory and fact observation. I was just thinking a bit more about my understanding of your theory of the cultural mind. And I was wondering if you could differentiate it between that and, say, a theory that you that we have big brains in order to learn how to hunt, something specific, something that's been proposed in the literature. So would your theory be, to use an old-fashioned economic term, less roundabout, perhaps, than learning to hunt, in the sense that all you're requiring people to do is imitate others, whereas when you're talking about learning to hunt, you're learning quite challenging motor skills involved in hunting, throwing spears at animals, and so on. So would there be a difference in terms of how important a investment there would be in your theory versus the theory of learning to hunt?
So in general, I guess there are a lot of these kind of single factor explanations for how the world works. What I don't see as often is kind of formalizations of those ideas and clear and precise tests that would tell you whether that was true and whether it was not true and to what it applies to. But I will also say that, the cultural brain, so in the problem in theory, we talk about theories and theoretical frameworks. The cultural brain hypothesis is more like a theoretical framework. It is making some specific predictions, but there are also more specific details like the kind that I described with getting males involved in child rearing, right? So now you're kind of getting into that. So it could be that things like the social brain hypothesis or hunting are specific instantiations of something that would fit within this theoretical framework. But I think often there's a lot more work that ought to be done in some of these theories to specify exactly what the assumptions are, what the logic are, what the predictions are, what would falsify it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. Manveer.
Thank you, Michael. That was a great talk.
Thanks.
So my question, and you actually touched upon this briefly in responding to Clark at the end, but I was just wondering if you could discuss some examples that really demonstrate the added value of a cultural evolutionary psychological approach in policy implementation. Yeah.
And in general, like in just about anything, or?
Yeah, like how can everything you've just described help us make better policy? And maybe there are case studies that you've been a part of or things that you have in mind.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll pick on some specific examples. So I think, for example, the corruption work, because these are theoretical frameworks, they give you kind of constraints on what might be going on, like what should I be looking for? And in this case, what I should be looking for are the mechanisms by which people are cooperating. And because we know cooperation is hard, one of the things that you should be able to do is disrupt underlying mechanisms that potentially affect higher scales of cooperation. So that in a place like Australia, you should expect to see more cronyism and less nepotism because of an emphasis on mateship, which is actually what you find. And so that is what you would want to target in that case, right? Joe's work on kin is an example of inclusive fitness, or the norms that build on that needing to, I guess, be undermined to set this thing off. Now there could be new recombinations once you've got institutions that embody these things, but it's telling you where you can look for these kinds of questions. The other thing that comes to mind is Michelle Gelfand's recent paper on tightness and looseness. So if you think about norm psychology and you think about where people are acquiring their norms, to what degree they're likely to be compliant, to what degree they enforce norms on each other, to what degree they rely on institutions to enforce them, then it tells you about what policies are more likely to work in different situations. So she's saying it after the fact. There hasn't been an opportunity to kind of prospectively to do that, but you do see that. So you see in Australia has been able to achieve kind of zero COVID to a great extent, huge institutional punishment. Huge amounts. I mean, you see this in the Melbourne data with antisocial punishment. People will cut people down, and they will tell on their neighbors if they're not doing it, if they're not complying with what the institution says. In East Asian countries, you see more tightness, people following norms. So again, it tells you this policy is likely to work here, and this policy is not likely to work here. But I can only kind of project because this aspect of cultural evolutionary public policies is in its infancy. So I've gotten to try things and see if they work, and they seem to stick. They seem to provide some insight, but there hasn't been that kind of definitive, large scale. This is clearly provided insight. This is the way we should do things in the future.
It would also be interesting if you could test whether there is a value of having a cultural evolutionary psychological perspective in policy implementation. I don't know, you get somehow people who are trained in it and people who are not. Because I wonder to what degree it's like people who know the cultural context and have like good folk intuitions for how people think in those societies, how much work can that do?
It's a good question. I mean, I guess the other analogy I use is like we got to gunpowder without understanding much about elements and and theories of chemistry. We can go a long way without ever understanding this stuff. But we can also waste a lot of time doing nonsensical things. I mean, another example is, the failure. So institutions, economists often think about institutions as driving things, right? But from a cultural perspective, those institutions rest on these invisible cultural pillars like rule of law, like a non-reliance on kin. And so when you go to Afghanistan and you try to implement your policies, implement your institutions, or, Liberia takes its institutions from the United States, they don't work quite as well because the culture is missing. And that is a direct kind of application of cultural evolutionary theory, right? The institutions alone cannot be transplanted so easily. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
I can't read this properly. Is it Lizia?
Yes, Lizia. I'm
Hi.
totally impressed with your presentation, and I even, you probably know that this, but in modern society, technological progress is a function of the growth of population in the long run, not the level. Okay, it's not a scale effect. It's a population has to grow in order for ideas grow to sustain the growth of the stock of ideas. Okay, in ancestral societies, level was enough. The amount of individuals and higher amount of individuals were enough to sustain technological progress, the progress of ideas. Okay, based on that, I made I and Oliver Singh, but all faults are mine. We made a simple model comparing ancestral environments and modern environments based on the rationality hypothesis. And the predictions are, in ancestral societies, if you have difference in density, in population density, yes, you can have more time to raise your children, for example, because you have more output in the region, okay? Not output per person, because people will have children, of course, but in Malthusian eras. But you can have higher technological progress. So the difference in density matters. Nowadays, we agree, difference in population density does not matter due to the need for technological progress. So this is not a relevant ecological progress, variable anymore. Does it make sense to you? Does it?
I must admit, I don't quite follow some of the difference.
If you could understand my English.
No, it's entirely on my side, but maybe just send me your paper. I should probably read it. It sounds.
Would you mind? Okay, thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you, Lucia. I think we're out of time if there are no more questions. Thank you so much for having me. It was fun.